But the topic obviously will keep, I hope it keeps you awake as well. Today I'm going to be talking about our works, our excavations and field work at the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. And I shall now attempt to share my screen with you. Let's have a look. It has to be this one. And then I have to put it. Can you tell me if that's working?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, just so that I was talking myself really good. My name is Clare. I'm based at the German Archaeological Institute here in Istanbul. And I've been here, a couple of years now, but previously I was working in Berlin at the central office in the Orient department. And since 2013, I completed my PhD in 2013 in Cologne. And after that, I was lucky enough to get a position, a postdoc position at the German Archaeological Institute in a project of the then director, he's since passed away, obviously, Klaus Schmidt. And in 2014, sadly, he passed away, and the project was entrusted to me under it was said at the time, okay, until the new project leader comes, which I had to find. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, the new project coordinator didn't arrive, and I've kept this position, and I've now been here, as I say, about, 7, 8 years now in total, but 2 years in Istanbul. And my main area of interest is the Neolithic, so from hunter going to farming. And of course, a big part of that, obviously, is my project, which is focusing on Göbekli Tepe, which I think most people have heard about from, well, I hope not just from the bad pages on the internet, because there's a lot of bad stuff out there. Yeah, this is a project which has been funded. You see my sponsors at the top here, or cooperation partners as well. But the project that I'm going to be presenting to you this evening or today is actually financed by the German Research Foundation, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and they've been generously sponsoring this project since 2009. It's a long-term project. We've got another couple of years left of our funding. Yeah, so the title of my presentation today is Göbekli Tepe, the world's oldest ceremonial site. And we're going to be, I want to give you sort of broad sort of introduction and details to the site, and really fill you in as much as I can about what's going on, and where we are at the moment. Because of course, it's a bit of a big site. There's a lot going on. We had a lot of work done in the past 7, 8 years, including, and I'll show you in a few moments, 2018, we became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which was also a lot of work for us and for everyone involved. So yeah, let's head on into it. The first slide here, you can see the site from the air. On the left-hand side, this is one of the most recent photographs of the air of the site. At the moment, you see here 2 shelters which were constructed in just a couple of years back, 2017, 18. And it was the sort of preparations for these building works that a lot of our new research results have come from, because for the first time we were doing deep sounding so that they could actually anchor these new shelters into the ground. Of course, had to drill them into the underlying bedrock, which actually gave us a chance, first off, in small sort of soundings, to see the very lower layers of the Göbekli Tepe mound. On the right-hand side, inside is the main excavation area. And we talk about 2 areas today in my talk. The main area, or the main excavation area here in the southeast, and the northwestern area here in the northwest of the site. This one here, this is actually open to the public. You can see the public walkways here. This is the actual path you would take if you were to visit the site today. This second shelter over here in the northwest isn't actually accessible to the public yet, but I think it's on the cards, and as soon as we've got the excavations in this area are pretty well, so we've got a bit of work to do there before something's actually visible, or visible to the visitors, we can actually open it up. But I think in the midterm, this area will be opened up as well. On the right-hand side, you can see inside this main excavation area shelter, you can see here the special buildings, which I think many of you have seen already. the famous T-pillars and the circular or round oval enclosures. Very briefly, because I don't know what stand or what your background is, are you much probably aware of the archaeology, or generally aware of the archaeology down in the southeast of Turkey. We're there in an area which is part of the Fertile Crescent. So this is an area where we have the first how can you put it, the first sort of movements towards sort of transition, or the earliest movements towards transition from hunter-gathering to food-producing economies in the 10th millennium BC. But of course, you know, there are different packages in the Neolithic package. There are different things that we have to go into place before we have the developed Neolithic. So, you know, we have sedentism, for example, but sedentism we know actually starts much earlier, back in the Epipaleolithic. I've got a picture here from Ohalo 2, which is a site in Levant, where we have sedentism from the 14th millennium, for example, so back in the Epipaleolithic. But then we have other sort of components coming in much later, domesticated plants and animals, for example. As I say, in our area, one of the earliest areas where we see this development, that comes in around the middle of the 9th millennium. Of course, comes in as of about 7000 BC, but there are new finds coming from different parts of Turkey and different parts of the Near East now, which are perhaps pushing that frame back in time into the PPN. PPN is obviously a term we have to note, pre-Pottery Neolithic. So we have the Epipaleolithic here, which roughly ends around 9600 at the end of the Younger Dryas, and we have the amelioration of the climate around 9600 into what we refer to as the early Holocene. And the PPA, Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, is the first part of this development, and then we have the Pre-Pottery Neolithic B, which is then subdivided into early, middle, and late. Now, Göbekli Tepe fits in, as you can see here, between 9500 and roughly 8000 BC. So we're there more or less in the PPNA, the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, the early PPNB into the middle PPNB. At the actually end of the site is a bit difficult to grab and grasp at the moment, but we're having good indications from the lithics, for example, that the occupation of Göbekli extend into the middle PPNB period. So,
Dr. Clare?
Yeah.
We're still seeing only the first slide, at least on my computer.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm flicking through. Okay. Shall I restart the PowerPoint? Should we see if that helps?
That you just advanced to the second one just now.
Oh, okay. And now?
Nothing.
Nothing.
I mean, if maybe some other people could chime in, but that's what I'm seeing.
Between 1 and 2. Can you see that?
I see 2 right now.
Okay.
Is yours full screen?
Mine is full screen.
Yeah, because ours isn't full screen. What we're seeing is
it's not full screen. What you're seeing? Okay.
No, we're seeing like the presenter side.
Oh, okay. That's very strange because
I think you have to select the monitor or something on.
Oh gosh, I knew this was going to happen.
When you share it, you have to.
Okay. Try again. Okay, I'm opening it again.
Yeah.
Right. Are you seeing something now?
It's coming in.
Okay, if I go on now, that's the presenter's view. I'm going to go onto full screen now.
Okay.
Is that clear?
No, it's still on that other screen. I don't know why.
Oh, for heaven's sake! Oh dear. Let's see.
If nothing else, you could just keep it on the presenter side and keep
Yeah.
clicking through each.
It's a bit annoying though, isn't it? It's not very, oh, I do hate this thing. Let's have a look. Ansicht. Of course, we're in Germany, isn't it? Start presentation. Okay, how's that? No.
Still the same. I haven't seen this happen before. It's weird.
No, I haven't.
But you say on your side it's full screen.
It's full screen, yeah.
Yeah.
What's this? How's that?
There you go. We're good.
Yeah, and if I click now?
Yep.
It's working.
All right, I'm going to mute myself. It looks great.
Oh, hallelujah. Okay, I think that was a technical fault on my side. I'm sorry about that. Let's just get rid of this thing that's in the way here. Okay, now, yeah? Okay, so you can see the last slide. This is then the Fertile Crescent. And as I was talking to you just now, I was giving you a brief rundown of the chronology and the context of the site. You can see here the Epipaleolithic and the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, B, early PPNB, and then the later periods, middle PPNB. And of course, as I said, Göbekli Tepe fits in the early Holocene at the transition from, or it starts just after transition from the Younger Jurassic to the early Holocene. We have PPN8 at the site, early PPNB, and possibly into the middle PPNB as well, although we have no radiocarbon dates for that. But we have the lithics, which tend to sort of point us in this direction when we compare them to other sites. Okay, so let's have a look at the location itself. We're in Turkey, obviously. This is southeastern Turkey. We have here the Syrian-Turkish border, as you can see here. The site of Göbekli Tepe lies here in the Gurmush Mountains, about 730 meters above sea level. And it looks down around stretching down here to the south into Syria. Here is the city of Şanlıurfa. This is where the main museum is, where all our finds are actually stored and on display. And of course, the situation now with the landscape, you can see a few shots here of the landscape. The bottom one here is to the south, so this is the Haran Plain you can see here. Then we have a shot to the north where you can see the Taurus Mountains on good days with good visibility, and to the east the Karacadağ, which is an extinct volcano here in the north east. From here is very much a modern cultural landscape. It's very brown. I think this was in the autumn months that these photos were taken. But meanwhile, we have a lot of irrigation going on. We have all the water coming in from the reservoirs. We have canals bringing the water in, and actually it's green all through the year now, with a lot of farming going on here, obviously in the plain. But how was it in the past? Or let's just go have a brief look at the present again. Here we can see the precipitation. It's very low precipitation in the region, additional rainfall, mostly is rain. Sometimes there's had some snow this year down there as well, but very, very low, about 400 millimeters per year. So on the edge of sort of rain-fed agriculture. And the temperature, of course, is very extreme. In the summer, it can go up to 40 degrees, which isn't very much fun when you're working out there without any shade. And in the winter, it just gets grey, miserable, and cold and nasty. So it's not very pleasant weather at all. So it's always these, well, at least in the summer, we have some, and the climate is obviously a result of the geography of the region. You can see here a cut through Anatolia here with the mountains. So we have the Taurus Mountains here coming along here, and this is then the plain running into the northern Levant, so upper Mesopotamia. These are just a few graphs for Şanlıurfa and Diyarbakır. You can see here, like I said, the hot summer months, the cool, wet winters, and the only reliable rainfall actually in the autumn and in the winter. Yeah, and Haram Plain, I've overestimated it. I said 400. It says here 283, but of course we have that extra water also from the irrigation. So farming is not a problem down there at the moment. What was it like in the past? We have climate proxies, obviously, for the region in general. Unfortunately, for the Şanlıurfa region, for southeastern, this part of southeastern Turkey, the data that we have is very scarce. It's very sparse. We don't have a lot of paleoclimate data for the region at the moment, although we hope that's going to be changing pretty soon. Some work going on near to the site that's been undertaken by our colleagues from the Freie Universität in Berlin, who have been looking at the physical geography of the region and collecting some paleoclimate data. But unfortunately, that hasn't gone right back into the Neolithic yet. They're still in the Bronze Age with their sequences that they have. But we actually, for the reconstruction, general reconstruction, we rely more then on sort of more on proxies from neighboring regions. I'm not going to go through all of these proxies here. Various ones, you know, the characteristic ones, the speleothems, the marine, and the drillings cause lacustrine sediments, terrestrial sediments, etc. And they're showing, of course, what we would expect really for the Younger Dryas and the early Holocene, and that these are on the left-hand side, the lakes, which have been more of a focus in the central parts of Anatolia and southwestern parts of Anatolia. But you can actually see that in the Younger Dryas, which actually isn't on this graph here. In the Younger Dryas, we had a generally cold, dry climate, and in the early Holocene, you can see it quite well here on this graph. This is these are three proxies from ice core from Greenland, and also this one here, the Dead Sea water level. You can see here the time scale. So we're here, the Younger Dryas, for example, between 11 and 9,700, 600 BC. You can see this dip in the curve, which is a cold conditions, and then of course the steady amelioration. And you have this curve here, the Dead Sea water level, which is a good proxy for the amount of rainfall, at least in the Levant. Of course, we're not in the Levant, we're further north, but we have this very clear trend at around 8,200 BC. We have a lot of water coming into the Dead Sea, more precipitation taking place. So with the climate was improving. We're going to come to the radiocarbon dates up here in a minute, but you can see basically the sites in the region. These are T-pillar sites. Göbekli Tepe, of course, most important at the moment, with other sites in the upper Euphrates region, so northern Syria, in the Tigris region, which is a bit further to the east. So we're on the Euphrates, and the Tigris is a bit further east, and these are Tigris sites from the late Epipaleolithic and the early Holocene, the early Neolithic, and down here in northern Iraq. But I say we'll return to those data a bit later on. At the moment, I just want to give you a bit of a context, the climate, paleoclimate context of the site. So Younger Dryas, as I say, was probably cool and dry. There was a strong oak woodland reduction area, lots of grass is growing, and this period coincides with first sedentary hunter-gatherer populations in the Euphrates region. Now, if I can move my this here out of the way, I can see myself. So you can see here these black sites are sites that or these black dots are the sites that we know existed at this time, and we have a couple of white dots here for sites which may have been occupied at this time. So the situation in the late Neolithic, in the late Pleistocene, so in the Younger Dryas, there was a sort of a bit of something much about this period, really. The best information we do have is, for example, from Göbekli Tepe here, which is a settlement that stretches from the Younger Dryas into the PPNA and then stops. And we have a couple of sites here in northern Syria, and possibly a couple of sites in the Urfa region, but these were excavated in a very small scale in the 1960s, 70s. So what we know about what came before Göbekli Tepe is a bit limited at the moment, but we're hoping that will change with the new body that's recently, which I'll speak to you about in just a few moments. And then, of course, we have the early Holocene. This is the period then where we see the climate amelioration, dispersal of grasslands, and the gradual return of oak woodland. And of course, at this time, we have the cultivation of wild progenitors of cereals. So in the PPNA, so we're actually in this period here. This is the entire early Holocene here. and in the PPNA period, we have this, as I say, this amelioration, the gradual return of oak, woodland, and the cultivation of wild and pulses. And of course, after that, in the middle PPNB, around 8,500 onwards, then we have the domesticates coming in and the domesticated animals. And very importantly, at Göbekli Tepe, we have no evidence of domesticated species of animals or plants whatsoever at all. We're still waiting and hoping that that will come, but at the moment, it seems that the population at Göbekli Tepe was reliant on the wild forms of the animals, and there was this sort of the morphology of the species didn't change. We're still looking at wild species when we find them. Yeah, this is then a bit of a look at the sites in the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A. You see there's an increase in the number of sites, including here's in the Tigris region. As you can see, a lot of sites appearing in the Tigris region, also along the Euphrates. Of course, a lot of these sites have been found in the course of a lot of dam building going on in Southeastern Turkey, as a result of excavations, salvage excavations taking place before these dams were built. And the same applies to northern Syria as well. Göbekli Tepe is one of the few sites that wasn't discovered in dam construction works. And here you can see a sort of a pictorial summary of how we imagine the landscape to have looked at that time, so in the early Holocene. And here on the right, the gradual sort of the loss of the oak woodland in the Younger Dryas, and then the return of it in the early Holocene. Of course, the early Holocene is a longer period, not just the PPNA and the PPNB, it goes into the Pottery Neolithic. And of course, it's always, I just like to say this, that, you know, the early Holocene, although it comes over as a very sort of steady, you know, there's no big sort of incursions, or that's not totally true. We do have the little ice ages, one of which actually does fall in the Pottery Neolithic period, but that's another topic. That's a topic that I did actually for my PhD, where I was looking at the climate change, little ice age on late Neolithic economies, but that's at the end of that sequence. Okay, yeah, that's just a picture showing you how these rapid climate changes or these little ice ages work. You have this sort of cold air coming in from the north, but as I say, we won't go into that in any further detail. Let's go back to the site itself. You can see here again, on the left the map, on the right hand side you can see the site itself, an aerial view. This is just before, or a bit before, the new protective constructed in 2017-18. You can see here again the main excavation area, and we have a line of trenches here on the southwestern mound, and then trenches in the northwest, here on the mound, and here in a hollow. Actually, the site itself is not a perfect mound, but it's actually a sequence of sort of hollows or low-lying parts, and then higher mounds. So the mound itself is a sequence of hollows and sort of mounds or knolls. So this is a high part, this is the low part, and you can see a dip here as well, and then down here in a dip as well, and here's another mound. So it's a sequence of different mounds, which would actually speak in favour of different sort of focal points in the course of the settlement history. But unfortunately, our chronology is not that good at the moment. We don't have a lot of radiocarbon dates from the northwestern part of the site, only from the southeastern part of the site. So it's a bit difficult to say at the moment, but we have to remember that this site, you know, like I said, 9,600 to about 8,200 BC, we're looking at over 1,500 years of occupation at this site alone. That's 1,500 years, that's a long time. So I think we don't need to be surprised if there was some movement around the site. We know it from other sites as well, that in different centuries or, you know, different periods, the focus of the settlement actually shifts around the site. And you have then mounds developing or knolls developing in different parts. Bit of research history, I think that's important as well. The site was actually discovered in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, in the frame of a survey project undertaken by the Oriental University of Chicago. You've all heard of these names, I think, Robert Braidwood and Halit Chambel from the Turkish side. And then in 1995, the site, until 1995, the site was more or less not ignored. It was known, but it wasn't looked at any further. And it wasn't until 1995 that Harald Hauptmann, who had just completed excavations at the site of Megaliths, which is also a Tiepele site to the north of Göbekli Tepe, in one of the areas that is now inundated building. He had just finished completing his excavations there, and his student Klaus Schmidt went off in search of another site and came across Göbekli Tepe, and he realized that this site had potential, that there were fragments of Tiepele, as he'd seen already at Nevalli lying on the surface of Göbekli, actually protruding from the mound itself, and he recognized it as of significance. And in the mid-1990s, then research was in Harald Hauptmann as the excavation director and Klaus Schmidt doing the field work. And then in 2000, following the retirement of Harald Hauptmann, Klaus Schmidt then became the excavation director of this site. Both Hauptmann and Schmidt were at the German Archaeological Institute at this time. Okay, then I can speak a bit more about really more that I know, because this is when I joined the project 2013-14. This is the nomination or the inscription of the site at Manama in Bahrain in 2018. I was during the Turkish delegation and was there to witness the inscription. Yeah, this was a very big milestone for us, and it obviously brought a lot of changes to the site, both previously and since. Previously being, of course, the construction of the protective shelters, which was part of the nomination application, and then after that, the increasing number of visitors to the site. So there was a lot of work we were working on, a lot of things to do in where that was concerned. The site itself covers the site of the mountains. We have a first-degree archaeological conservation area and a buffer zone, and we're inscribed under 3 criteria, 1, 2, and 4, according to UNESCO, and none of which actually mention, this is quite important, none of which actually mention the site as being the place where we see the world's first temples. This is very much a title that was sort of pushed onto the site. Well, I mean, it's actually due to the archaeologists as well. Klaus Schmidt mentions it in a few of his publications, but he was never happy with the term temple itself. He was always saying, okay, it could be, but to be a temple has to sort of fulfill some criteria. But then he named his book, they built, in German, Sie bauten die ersten Tempel, they built the first temples, which was then taken on in the English translation. And since that point in time, it's more or less been known as the world's first temples. I think it's picked up very much by the media because of the world's first temple, 4 words, and it actually describes the site and it gives an interpretation, at the same time. And it's out there, and it's very hard to change that. And I'll be speaking in a moment why I think the world's first temple is probably not the best term, but the buildings there in a broader way, they had more than that function. And as I say, temple, like Klaus Schmidt also wrote, needs a building to fulfill certain criteria to be a temple. Temple economy. It has to be a place where a certain deity was worshipped. We have no evidence for deities at all. We have perhaps evidence for ancestors. The Tiepeles could be the ancestors, depictions of ancestors, but we don't know whether they would be being worshipped as deities. And I think there are other functions that these buildings would have had. So I think temple is so restrictive. And for that reason, I always refer to the buildings, the monumental, you hear me saying it now, these structures, special buildings, monumental buildings, structures, features, I tend to sort of work my way around that. Yeah, and then in the past few years, 2019, we had Göbekli Tepe year, which was initiated by the Turkish government, and of course, the official reopening of the site. Now, this was very big for the region, of course, as well, because, of course, it had suffered in previous years due to the Syrian conflict, and the tourism had collapsed, the tourism sector, and of course, with this new UNESCO World Heritage Site, this new status, with lots of attention from the media, also being, of course, pushed a bit by the Turkish authorities as well. It's really brought the area, the region back to life, and we're having lots and lots of tourists there at the moment. Of course, for tourists, you need an exhibition and visitor centre. This is also constructed by the sponsor of the site, which is Dorsch Group. So if you go to the site, this is the first port of call when office and a visitor centre, which by now is actually too small. I think it's going to be made, but they're going to build a bigger one pretty soon. But of course, it's all mod con. You know, you've got the swipe screens, and you've got sort of 3D, sort of 180-degree cinema experience, and various things. So it's a good thing if you're a teenager, perhaps. But yeah, okay, I've seen it a few more times, so it does get a bit yeah. I won't say any more. Actually, before the visitor centre was built, we did, of course, do survey in this part of it. We're just about a kilometre from the side. You can see the two shelters here, and here's the information centre, the ticket office. And in this area, we have an area of basalt, which you can see here on the right-hand map. So it's mostly limestone, but with sort of small islands of basalt all dotted over the place. And I think this is probably one of the reasons that attracted the people to the site in the first place, is that right on their doorstep, not only they had these wonderful views over the landscape, but they also had this raw material right on their doorstep. So they were actually quarrying the basalt here, and a lot of the grinding stones which they were using then, among other things, to grind the wild crops, but also for other purposes like grinding minerals, working leather, etc., that sort of thing. They were actually taking this basalt from these this area just a kilometre away. Yeah, here again the shelters. So yeah, this was a pretty challenging time. We were there most of the time, or all the time, when these things were being constructed, which meant protecting the whole site itself. The whole area underneath the new shelters was sort of sand-sacked up, and of course the deep soundings had to be completed on time, and we had to be there as well because of, you know, it happened on various occasions that a bulk was in the way and had to be removed so that they could get their girders across and that sort of thing. So it was a very challenging time for everyone. You can see here a few impressions of what it was like working on this building site. This is the old wooden roof, which serves as a platform for the building platform for the new sort of helter skelter. So yeah, it was a very interesting thing to be involved with. And of course, the visitors, that was all opened, and I've got figures here for 2019. You can see we're the 8th most popular site in Turkey in 2019. 20, of course, fell flat because of COVID. This year, or 2021, was a bit better, but I think the best impression we get is from 2019. We can see that we had per day roughly over 1,000 visitors, which is a lot of people, especially if you're working in the trenches and be shouted every 5 minutes to move because, you know, they want to take a photograph. Some people are like that, but most people are fine, but they want to say hi and, you know, how you're doing and what you're doing. So yeah, it's been a bit of a success, as you can see. And that's not only due to the archaeology, but also due to the media. A lot of media attention. You probably know the Netflix series Atiye. I think it's got a different name in English. The Gift, I think it's called in English, which is set in Göbekli Tepe. I think it's been quite proud of myself. It's yeah, amusing to say the least. But the thing is, of course, you get people coming to the site actually asking where the scenes were actually shot. In a few sequences, they're actually filming in a cave where there are T-pillars inside. And I've been asked on several occasions, you know, where is the cave? And I've had to tell people, I'm sorry, but we don't have a cave with T-pillars in. So this sort of media is very influential, and it really sort of forms people's ideas of the site actually before they arrive. And of course, we had hot air balloon rides going on more recently. And I don't know if you heard a couple of years back, no, last year, in fact, I think it was, we had these these monoliths, these metal blocks appearing out of nowhere in the US and in Europe as well. It was all sort of very sort of, you know, UFO-y sort of, you know, what's going on, esoteric direction. And of course, one also appeared in the village of Öğrenci, which is the next village away. And that was very exciting, of course. I mean, it was obvious that it wasn't a UFO. If it was, then they were taking care to make sure that they were full of the site, because the actual buffer zone is just a few meters away from this. So they placed it outside the buffer zone, which was quite nice of the aliens. But it wasn't the aliens. It was actually a publicity stunt by the Turkish authorities to launch the Turkish space program. Which was launched then by the president of Turkey. And then shortly after that, the thing disappeared. And the villagers were quite sad about that because they enjoyed the attention, as you can see. Brings us then to the stakeholders. I mentioned the village of of course, this I really like to mention in my talks because, of course, it's not just me, it's not just the archaeological team, it's not just the authorities, but it's also the local people, who are also stakeholders in the site. And I'm very keen to have them involved as much as I can in the project, and which they are. I mean, we have our guards, for example, our workmen who accompany us, who have been actually working at the site longer than I have. Some of them know the site even better than I do, and can read the archaeology better than I can usually. They also know the old trenches. They know where to turn out. It's all in their minds. And of course, the younger generation is also with us. And they're now working, of course, in the ticket office as guards as well, and various shuttle bus drivers and that sort of thing. So it's also a very important factor for the local economy, which we can only support. Of course, there are others. The city of Llanwrth, of course, the local councils and the local authorities also have a very big interest in the site because, of course, it's bringing people into the region. And of course, the public as well, not just the national, but also the international visitors to the site who are relying on publications that we make and our interpretations. So we have a very big responsibility, in fact, when we're working there. Okay, now let's get back to the archaeology, because I think this is probably what you want to hear about more than anything else. So this, on the left-hand side, you can see the main excavation area. So this is the area underneath the Pringle. So far, and not all of them, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is it 8? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, yeah, 8 special buildings, or 8 temples so far excavated. All of these were actually excavated by Klaus Schmidt, but none of them have yet been excavated in their entirety, which is quite surprising. It just didn't happen. And they're labeled A to H in the order of their discovery, with the exception of building E, which was only interpreted as a special building after the discovery of C and D, because before that it just wasn't clear. It's just the stone foundations in the plateau. But when then the buildings C and D were discovered with this carved floor, was also one of these special buildings where the superstructure was actually just gone, disappeared. Anyway, you can see here building B, which is here. So we have A down here. I haven't got a photo of that. B is here, which is this one. Then we have C, the largest one over here. And then D, you can see, hang on, no, I've got the mix up. This is D, sorry, and this is C. These are all old photos by Klaus Schmidt. You can see how the excavations sort of progressed when I show you the later, a few photos later on. And here then the aerial photos, I was mentioning, it's just the carved foundations in the limestone plateau over here. A, B, C, and D are in the main excavation area underneath this wooden shelter. This is the wooden work platform as it was that was used for construction of the new Pringle. So A and D are under there. Here's G just next to it. We have F over here on the southwest mound and H over here in the northwestern part of the site. Now, in a lot of publications, you often hear, oh, there are loads left to excavate, at least 20. I don't know where this number 20 comes from. Well, I do. It's in one of Klaus Schmidt's publications. But 20 I actually see in the geo radar or the ground penetrating radar that has been done. Now, this was done quite a few years back in 2013. I think it's time we did a new one with new technology. But because of all what's been going on, we haven't actually got around to doing that yet. But you can see these anomalies here. This is the same area. Here's the main excavation area. So this is this here, and here's the southwest mound, which is over here. Here then are the northwest hollow and the northwest mound over here. And this is where then the ground penetrating radar was done in this area here between. There's a very big anomaly here underneath where our offices now stand, our work offices, our containers. So here would be a very large structure or anomaly in this area. In fact, if you take this, I mean, the C over here is, I think, 30 meters in diameter, and this is a lot bigger. So if this is a special building, it is at least 50 meters in or 60 meters in diameter, which would actually be absolutely massive. But I'm a bit skeptical about that. And then there are other anomalies here in this depression or in this hollow over here. You can see the anomalies. It's three stuck together, agglomerative sort of anomalies. And then we have 3 over here as well, and then this anomaly here. Now, the reason that I'm very skeptical about this ground penetrating radar, about the results, is because now we've done actually some excavation here where we found H where Klaus Schmidt found H in 2011. And actually, it's not showing up here on this. I mean, this anomaly here is a lot bigger and expands over this way. And H is actually in there somewhere. I mean, perhaps not deep enough. An alternative interpretation of these anomalies could be that they're actually structures, natural, artificial structures in the limestone plateau where quarrying has been done, where there are natural dips, that sort of thing, or cuts. So this is something that needs to be looked at later on when excavations do take place in these other areas. But as I say, I think first of all, we have to be very careful about interpreting these anomalies as special buildings at this time. So what are the characteristics of these special buildings? So here we can see building D, which is observed with the central, or a bit off center, but we always say central T pillars here in just off center in these carved pedestals. This is actually the limestone floor of the plateau, which has been painstakingly smoothed, and these pedestals in which or podestas in which these large T pillars are actually stood in are actually also carved from the natural limestone bedrock. So it's all one thing that hadn't been put on extra, but it's carved in one piece. Have the T pillars about 5.5 meters in height, and we have smaller ones actually in the wall or inserted into the walls of the building. Now it's very important, you know, a lot of people think that these were freestanding stone circles. They were never that. Without the walls, these things would have fallen over. The walls were built first, they left slots, and into these slots were then inserted these T pillars. And we also think now that the thing was actually roofed over. A lot of these T pillars in the walls are actually plus minus 6, I use inches, 6 inches, 15 centimeters, roughly on the same thing. And also that also applies to the 2 central pillars. And actually the 2 central pillars, the foundations in these pedestals here, they're only about 6 inches deep, less than that. So they would have fallen over. They needed some support. We have support now, which are these sort of metal ropes, but they would have needed some support in the past as well. And that probably was the roof, the weight of the roof on top of these T pillars. We don't know exactly how to reconstruct this roof, but I think this evidence speaks in favour that the buildings were roofed over. And of course, we have the T pillars themselves. This is one of the central pillars in digital. We know that they are anthropomorphic. You know, they're depictions of the human form. The top of the T being the head, and then the shaft being the body. You can see here a belt buckle. We have a loincloth made from fox fur. I mean, the detail is absolutely fantastic. You get near to, you can actually see the claws carved into the fox loincloth. We have the hands here resting on the belly. These lateral bands here are often interpreted as a stoa, so the garment worn by priests. I mean, it's all really sort of, I wouldn't use this sort of description because it sort of harks back to this sort of temple narrative, as it were. But they are probably items of clothing. And this one here you can't see very well, but there is also on these central pillars that they're actually wearing a necklace as well with pendants. But no facial features, strangely enough. Although they were obviously capable of doing that. We have statues with facial features, but these T pillars, they were never given facial features for some reason. And then here another pillar in that same circle in the same building. You can see, you know, covered in depictions. We'll go into the depictions a little bit at the end because this is something that is very broad and it's a lot of guesswork or educated guesswork. You can say what's being said here, but what we can actually say here is that we're being told a narrative. These are narratives that are being told. This is not just sort of the animals or the birds that they're seeing roaming around the landscape at the time, but these are you know, they appear in certain constellations, which is obviously, you know, a narrative. I often say to the visitors, you know, if we had a pillar here with a wolf and a girl in a cape, we'd know it was Little Red Riding Hood. And I think this is the same sort of principle here to the people of the Neolithic. They looked at this and they knew exactly which story was meant. These are the stories. This is the first time. This is why the site is so important, because the narratives, these prehistoric narratives, probably dating back before the Neolithic into the late Paleolithic, into the Younger Dryas. These are their narratives, which are actually for the first time carving in a built environment, not just caves. That's a natural environment. For the first time, they're building something, and actually narratives, their beliefs, their worldview onto these monuments. Okay, and then of course the preservation, that could only happen, of course, if these buildings were filled, and that pretty rapidly, because otherwise they would have been lost. So the fill was crucial for the preservation of the structures. Now, what the processes were that led to the inundation of the structures, I'll come to in just a moment. But safe to say, it was Klaus Schmidt who said that the buildings were inhabited. A person was buried at the end of their lives, when they died. The same was happening to the buildings, and this sort of thing has been observed at other sites where fire was used to burn the buildings down at the end of their life cycle. And he believed then that these buildings were actually interred, buried when they went out of use. But as I say, we'll come back to that interpretation in just a moment. Of course, the quarrying, you can see here the site, we're on the quarry here in the quarry area now. Here is a massive T-pillar still in situ that was never moved. Perhaps it broke at the time, perhaps they decided the monolith, but this is still actually in situ in the quarry as we speak. And there are other areas where we have the negatives, which I think I've got another slide you can see here. It's a negative in the plateau. This is a so-called terrazzo pit because afterwards I used this pit for mixing probably some sort of terrazzo mixture for the floors of buildable plaster mixture, and that's still preserved here. But you can see here these sort of slots, which are probably used to put in stakes to actually prise out the limestone. The limestone is quite soft, and also splits in natural layers. So this is probably the technique that we're seeing here, how they're actually splitting the blocks from the plateau and then dragging them out. And this is a reconstruction from the museum, how they see these T-pillars, how they were moved, probably very much like it. Yeah, so as I said, Göbekli Tepe is referred to as the world's first temples, but also more recently as a 0 point in time by the Dorsch group, who are, as I say, who did the exhibition center at the site. I sound a bit unhappy with the world's first temples, but I'm even more happier with the 0 point in time, because of course that would imply that we are at the very beginning of time, and that's just not true. We know that there was Paleolithic before it. Is a very unfortunate term to use for the site, but this has been used in a lot of the advertising by Dorsch Group for their center, for their information center, and for the media. In fact, in one place, I think it's referred to as ground zero in that site. This is something that, it just doesn't fit. But what is the evidence that they use to argue the world's first temples? Well, firstly, it was because Klaus Schmidt said that it was a purely ritual site. It was never a settlement. He said there was a clear absence of domestic buildings, and for that reason, it can only have been a ritual site. Secondly, of course, and enforcing that was the absence of water sources. Now he's saying, the nearest springs were at least 3 or 4 kilometers away down the hill. And of course, rivers, of course, nowadays, the nearest river, they're quite a walk away. But there are smaller rivers, of course. There's actually a river in Orenjik. I have no idea how long it's been flowing there, but in the winter it does carry water. I think, and I can also tell you that there are fish bones from the site from small fish. So there must have been water somewhere nearby. We've been doing a lot more flotation just in recent years, and a lot of these small bones that weren't picked up previously have been picked up more recently. So we have fish bones at the site. So yeah, this was a small fish as well, so it wasn't coming from far. The buildings, which is another sort of ritual thing, and archaeological evidence for feasting, and feasting as an incentive to the workforce to actually build these things. Because when these special buildings were excavated, they found lots and lots of animal bones, which Klaus would interpret as being the leftovers of these big feasting events where groups came to the site to work as a group to build or bury the structures. And of course, there's the famous evidence for beer fermentation from big limestone troughs. So this is really the evidence that was put forward for this world's first temple. And I've got a few, I should have translated this into English, but a few quotes from Klaus Schmidt, for example. He's saying here that, we know what the domestic buildings of the Neolithic looked like in this period, and what we find at Göbekli Tepe has nothing to do with that. Therefore, what we found at Göbekli Tepe must be a ritual site. And then with regard to the water, he says, let me just read what he said. There is evidence for the storing of water for cisterns. You can see here, cisterns is actually, we don't know how old these cisterns are. There are cisterns in the plateau, and they're still in use until modern times, you know, by the shepherds to water their animals. So he was aware that you know, these structures were there on the plateau, and that would be the only form of water collection there would have been. And then, of course, we come to the intention with buildings. So this is another reason, as I was saying, why he was sort of this ritual interpretation for the site. And he was saying a lot of the rubble used to fill these buildings came from the, for example, from the quarry, and a lot of flint artifacts in there as well. So using it as rubbish, tipping their rubbish more or less in there, or collecting the rubbish and using it to bury the buildings. And the bones, of course, as evidence for large-scale feasting, and this feasting, of course, interpreted then as collective work events. That's new evidence, or relative new evidence. I mean, this is the northwestern part of the site now under this triangular structure. So here's building H. Let's just go on one. So here's building H. You can see here one of the central pillars. This is the actual state of excavation as it is now. It hasn't progressed since 2015 because, of course, you know, I've told you what we've been doing since then. We've had other things to do. And we had to do 5 different deep soundings in this area to anchor the new structure, the new roof structure, protected roof structure, and a drainage channel here for the rainwater. And then for you, this area here, number 5 and number DR2, drainage 2, and also into, then after that into 2 and 3, because here we have evidence at last for the domestic occupation at Göbekli Tepe. So in other words, Klaus Schmidt, I think, was unable to see this, obviously, in his excavation. So here we have it. This is the first area, the K10-13-23 trench, where we have these obviously not monumental structures. We have a kilometre here, multi-phase buildings going on. We have activity zones with hearths. You know, this is one of the first hearths that was found. You know, they were never found before. So people were sitting here. They were using bone tools, and they were actually producing beads from bone, bird bone, and from stone. You can see here that this is all PPNA in date. I'll show you the evidence of that in a moment. We have radiocarbon dates as well, which place this in the PPNA, so 9,500 roughly, 9,400, 300. And that site of BC. You can see these floors, you know, very fine stratigraphy. So they're renewing the floors. This is a section here from this building, looking westwards. And we have also plaster floors, actually one on top of the other. So we have continuity of space in these buildings. Very much what we know, like we know from other Neolithic sites as well, when we're looking at the domestic evidence. And this is then a few examples from other sites in the region. This is from Jebel Ahmar in northern Syria, here the Greek construction, and also from Pakistan that we're looking at. It's very, very similar to what we found now at Göbekli Tepe. And as I was saying, it's PPNA in date. We have the radiocarbon data, but we also have some wonderful arrowheads from this area, so-called Jordan Valley caramel points, and also these El Kiam points. You can see here very characteristic from their shape of the tongue. And then drainage 2, this is in the drainage, this is the new GT2 or the new shelter under construction. Here we have a drainage channel. In this drainage channel, it was only 1 meter wide, but we got down to the bottom to have similar domestic structures, PPNA structures as well. And you can see them here. There are 8 in total. Some of the buildings are sharing walls, so they're agglomerative, multi-phase buildings, yeah, they were built directly onto the underlying natural bedrock. So very early in, we don't have any radiocarbon data from here, but compared to the K10-13 ones I just showed you, these are very similar and are probably PPNA, most, or definitely PPNA in date. What am I saying? It's definitely PPNA. The lithics also tell us that we're dealing with a domestic settlement. We have just had a PhD completed, the first PhD on the lithics, in fact, from the site. And you can see here, Jonas, who's responsible for this work, he actually took one of the buildings here This is a PPNB rectangular building, and he took out all the lithics. So we've got all the lithics from this excavation, and it was a lot of stuff to work through. You can see here he worked through over 23,500 chipped stones, which is works out about 30 cubic meter of soil. It's a very high density of lithics at the site. I mean, you just walk around and you see, you know, a PhD here and a master thesis here on the floor. I mean, it's so much lithics. And you can see here a few impressions of that. But, you know, this, and I'm told, I mean, I've read his thesis, and you know, we're seeing a very typical repertoire for a domestic setting of the tool types, you know, the arrowheads, the scrapers, the blades, etc. So it's also another indicator for the domestic site. This is the same building. Now, interesting. So here we have the A, B, C, D monumental structures again, and here on the surrounding mounds we have these rectangular structures, and these are from the early pre-Pottery Neolithic B. So from the PPNA to the early PPNB, the transition being about 8,700 BC, we have the discovery of the corner of buildings. So they stop don't stop building round oval, they still continue building round oval, but the buildings become more rectangular in shape. So this is why it's normal for the region. The early PPNB is characterized by this change in the architecture, so from round oval to rectangular, but without the round oval being totally abandoned, they still build that way. And you can actually see here what's quite interesting about this building here, building 16, where the lithics came from. You can actually see that the building was changed. You have here a plaster floor, and you can just make out here it's actually round. And they changed this round building, and they removed the bench that was perhaps here, and they made it more rectangular. So we actually have this transition from round to rectangular buildings themselves. We actually see this transition happening in the archaeology, which I've actually not known from any other site so far. So this is very exciting as well. And here's one of the PPNB rectangular buildings. These blue ones here, you can see they're actually all of the same type. So you have a more or less rectangular or trapeze sort of shape, and then you have at one end, you have a bench. Here's the bench, you can see it, and a T-pillar, one or two T-pillars actually inserted into that bench, and then a niche here, and here various implements, which probably are not in situ, then on the floor of the building, but collapsed into the building from the overlying floor. And we have here also good evidence from the architecture that there was an upper floor to these buildings. So what you're actually seeing here now is actually the cellars of the buildings. Above that, there would have been another story, another level. So whereas Klaus Schmidt was, and the T-pillars were actually supporting on the floor. So whereas Klaus Schmidt was saying these rectangular buildings were also ritual buildings, I think more likely is the cellars of these domestic buildings, and the upper story is missing, okay? And with the roof and the floor actually collapsed then into this lower part, which is, you know, a change of our interpretation. We have all this evidence now for domestic and PPNB, but if we're looking at the PPNA, if we're looking at the PPNB now, we're seeing, you know, all of these are joining, and if all of these are contemporaneous, if they're all existing at the same time, we're looking at a very big settlement, a flourishing settlement in the PPNB in the 9th millennium, or the first half of the 9th millennium BC. And they still the special buildings here in the center. So here's the result here in a more generalist way, also a schematic depiction. So we have the bench, we have the pillar, we have the niche, which is probably an entranceway. Perhaps there's a ladder coming down here from this floor, and then evidence for a potential upper story here. It's actually floor plaster actually on the edges here. And these so-called portal stones here, we find them in all of us nearly. These are actually probably the entrances. They're actually made of stone, limestone. Some of them actually are rubbed on the edges, so you actually see where people were slipping in and going down the ladders into these lower parts of the building. And these then we find actually collapsed onto the floor of the structures sometimes. And this sort of building type is not only now known from Göbekli Tepe, but we have very similar ones from other T-pillar sites in the region. This is one from Harvitsuan Tepe, which is not 30 km away further east. I'll show you a map with the other PPN or the other T-pillar sites in just a moment. So settlement, yeah. And then, of course, if you have a settlement, you need the burials. And now, quite typical of the burials at the time was subfloor burials beneath the floors of the domestic buildings. We did another drainage channel from the main excavation area. This drainage channel is about here. We see this long 1 meter wide trench. In this area here, it's a bit wider, we hit a PPNB building. This is then the floor, and there was a kidney-shaped pit which became visible, which we thought, that looks pretty suspicious, and we went down, and lo and behold, we have had our first subterranean subfloor burial, which is very common for the period. The burials, there was no sort of necropolis or so that was separate from the settlement, but the burials were actually in the settlement itself, usually under the floors of the buildings or near to the buildings. And this is a very interesting one. We had 3 individuals. It was disturbed, the grave, but we had 3 individuals, 3 skulls. You see 2 here. One is actually underneath this other skull, so it could organize afterwards. 2 females and 1 male or female. We had a child, and we had 2 adults on the young adult. And here you can see the grave goods were weren't very many at all. We just had about 3 very long flint blades, and that was it. And the bodies themselves were actually resting on a lower floor of the predecessor building. The thing is, water. I mentioned water just now. This is a map showing the runoff of the site today. So here is the main excavation area, southwest now and northwest part of the site, and you can see all of this. This is where the water actually runs down. We have a bit of a cliff here, which goes down towards the village further to the west. But you can see here the drainage. The water is actually flowing down from here, and it's no surprise that we have these cisterns down here. You can see them actually here in the aerial photograph here from the ground, and also channels carved into the limestone, which is actually funneling the water towards them. Nice cisterns. Now, we didn't know what age these cisterns were. It was debated. Are they Neolithic? Are they later? Now we've had good results from one of them. One of them was actually excavated in the early 2000s, and bones were actually retrieved, human bones, and these were sent to Berlin and weren't looked at for a while. Then they were looked at, and it was discovered that these bones were actually showing scratch marks, very much typical of the post-mortal treatment of secondary burials in the Neolithic. Not only the bones of a dozen individuals actually stacked and collected in the cistern. Now, we're pretty certain that these bones are actually a pre-Pottery Neolithic secondary burial, which would then actually date at least this one cistern as Neolithic. So we know now, pretty certainly that a lot of these cisterns and channels that we see carved into the plateau are actually Neolithic in date. So they were actually harvesting the rainwater at the site. And if you recall, in the early Holocene, the climate amelioration, the precipitation rates at higher today. So they were having a lot more winter, autumn rainfall, and we can't even exclude that we're having summer rainfall as well. So they're actually, harvesting this water. Now we're going to come to keep with this topic and come to these 2 deep soundings here. The second one is pretty interesting. We have a similar carved channel actually in situ on the site as well. You can see it here, and you can actually see here, these have actually been removed from this area, but they were actually covered by limestone. This channel was covered by limestone, carefully erected, constructed to actually protect the water from, contamination through dust, etc. But they were actually covered over. It looks much more modern than its Neolithic date. And then if we come to this other area here, at area 3, we have this wonderful feature that came out. And this is unique to the whole region. I don't know of anything similar anywhere. But we have a very deep pit, 8 meters in diameter, 3 meters deep. It's only a few meters, 10 meters, or these are 10-meter wide trenches. It's only 10 meters away from this channel, and have this, what looks like wall here is actually ballast, and it's holding down. The ballast has been removed from it. You see these large slabs, and these slabs, when we actually dug into or excavated into this feature, 3 meters deep, is impressive, into the natural limestone plateau. We saw that these slabs were actually overlapping. So what we've got going on here is a bit of a corbelled roof. Now, corbelled roofing, this is very early for corbelled roofing. I mean, as far as I knew, corbelled roofing was perhaps known in Ireland, for example. We have this wonderful thing I forgot the name of the site now. Anyway, it comes much later. But now we have this evidence for corbelled roofing, at least 3 levels or courses of corbelled roofing around this structure. Now we don't know whether the corbelled roofing actually made a dome covering this pit, or whether it was just 3 or 4 levels or layers, courses of corbelled roofing and a flat roof. It's difficult to say. It hasn't been fully excavated at the moment. That needs to be done. But this is quite, and you see it's a very narrow passageway here. It's just wide enough for me to sort of go sideways down. This could have been an entrance for water as well, which would have flowed into this pit and been collected. So what we could have here, I'm not saying it's definitely the case, but it could be an on-site water system, which at the end of its function as a water system was then used to store lots of large slabs and stones, work pieces of slab, limestone, T-pillar, all piled up here and collected. So a very interesting feature, which hasn't been published yet. We have to do that, but it's as I say, it's quite unique. And if it is a water system, it would have held a lot of water. So they weren't just relying on the systems on the surrounding plateau, but they had water systems and water channeling in the area of the occupation itself. Now we're coming to the other main area of new results, which is the special buildings, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Now what we've got here is some radiocarbon dates from building D. I'll show you building D. That was the one with the central pillars with the with the T-pillar with the hands on the belt buckle and the loincloth. And these radiocarbon data were actually taken from the walls of the building. Now, the problem was with earlier radiocarbon dates from the site is that samples were taken from the fill, which wasn't actually giving us, it was giving us all various different, dates, incoherent dates. And also we have a problem that bones at the site cannot be radiocarbon dated because the collagen isn't preserved. But what we have here is this is a lot of charcoal samples taken from the mortar between the stones. And surprisingly, we're very surprised at this, is that we had 2 areas, two sort of clusters. Cluster A dating to the late pre-Pottery Neolithic A, which was expected for the round oval shape of the buildings. Klaus Schmidt always said those are PPN A and the rectangular ones are PPN B. But also in the same wall on the eastern side, we had dates which very reliable, but much younger, dating to the early PPN B. So 86 to 836 was surprising. We didn't expect this whatsoever. But if we compare that with results from the architectural studies, we know that you can see here there are 3 different phases. We have this purple, and we have this lighter blue, and we have this yellowy color. I'm sorry, I'm colorblind if that's wrong, but we can see this progression. Now, the outer phase here is the earliest phase of the building. And within the earlier building, the larger building, they actually built another one, which is here. And within that, they then built another one. So we have 3 different phases. And the best thing is that the radiocarbon dates actually tally with that. So the old dates that we have are actually from this blue color here. And the younger dates, the PPNB dates, are actually from this younger phase. So we actually have the combination of the architectural studies and the radiocarbon data working very, telling us that these things were in use for the PPA well into the early PPNB, which was not considered previously. So this later phase of the building is actually contemporaneous, was in use, in built in time as a rectangle around it, and that was something completely new. The same also applies to building B. I hope you can hear as my internet is not very stable. Now we have here 3 phases. Again, the outer phase is the oldest, and we have another, and the youngest inside. We haven't got radiocarbon dates from this, but we're expecting something similar. And that leads us then to this wonderful sort of, very bright, colourful sort of new sequence of really Klaus Schmidt differentiated just 3 different levels. Level 3 being PPNA, which were then these round special buildings, and PPNB being the rectangular buildings. So level 3 was PPNA for him. Level 2, the rectangular buildings, was early PPNB, and on top of that was a level 1, which was then the topsoil. But now we have a much more differentiated and intricate sort of this is all work in progress as well. I mean, this is going to change as well in the future, but you can see here how the rectangular buildings are then contemporaneous with the latest phases of these buildings here, of the special buildings. Although, of course, you know, they were built the first time a lot earlier. And then, of course, we come to the backfill. Now, for Klaus Schmidt, as I mentioned, he was saying, you know, they were intentionally backfilled and as a burial when they went out of use for whatever reason. We're now thinking that although this could be a possibility, there are possibly a certain amount of intentional backfill. The majority of this backfill stems from slope slides. So, like I said, you know, we have in the bottom, in this sort of dip, we have the monumental buildings and the rectangular buildings surrounding it. Now, what actually happens then is the pressure on the slope was increasing. And actually, if you look at this again, these younger dates are from the western part of D. And this was an area which is experiencing slope pressure from the west, from this side, pushing against it, and it was causing damage and actually reinforcing the wall in this part. This is what this rebuilding is probably about. They were reinforcing the western part of this building to stop it from slipping and from collapsing. So they're having a problem with slope pressure from the surrounding mound, and at some point it just gave way. And all of these layers, which you can see here, you can see it's lovely. It's actually sort of coming in from the north here and filling it up. We don't know the timing of these events. There's one event to this, but I think it's probably based on the stratigraphy. It's several events with perhaps some artificial sort of backfilling as well to sort of steady things or flatten things out. And you can see here this actually works. You can see this. So here we have the roofed structures. Here, the two-story PPNB buildings. This is the PPNB phase of the special building, and you have this slope slide coming in gradually, or I say we're not sure on the chronology, but filling up the PPNB phases of the special buildings. And of course, this then would account for all of the animal bone we find all lithics in the fill of these special buildings. This is actually coming then from the middens, from the collapsed buildings. The human bone that we find in the bits of fragments of human bone is probably coming from subfloor burials which have been disturbed and slipped into these buildings. So it's quite a different situation than perhaps previously thought. So it's not the ritual. Okay, so we haven't got the domestic. I mean, we've got the domestic now. There's not an absence of domestic. We have the water, and then we have an explanation for the backfill, and also the fact that the backfilling intentional in that respect, with feasting going on, but this bone material and all of what's been found in the buildings was actually being washed in through the slope pressure and then the subsequent collapse of the slope. So this is then an artistic sort of depiction of that. Here we see the situation previous. So here we have a later phase of building D and B and C. We see the mixture of round buildings and rectangular domestic buildings here on the slope, which is gradually growing higher and higher as they put new floors in and renew the buildings. Which slips in, and we have this really quite a catastrophic event with then a certain building C, for example, probably being restored or rebuilt as best they could. Here, building A now being built as a rectangular, not a round oval structure. And we have here also evidence for terrace walls. So they're actually trying to combat or trying to mitigate this slope pressure, which they're still having problems with. So they're building, you know, lots of little terrace walls all around the edge of the site. So there's still, you know, this earlier or this ritual area, keeping a domestic on the slope above, but they are still having problems with the slope pressure. So this leads to our new interpretation of the site. This is the reconstruction from 2011 by Klaus Schmidt and National Geographic, where it's very much, you know, the groups coming in and building meeting there, feasting there, and building these structures. And then we have the new results. We have this reconstruction of a settlement, which is then respecting then the ritual area, or the specialness, and of course the mound growing gradually on all sides, to the north, west, and east. To the south is actually open. So this is just a summary of what I just said. I don't think we need to dwell on that so much. So let's come back to you know, the function of these special buildings. Now, I think to deal with that, we need to again look once again at the chronology. So I mentioned here, so here's again our climate curves that I showed you. So you have the cold, dry, younger, driest, the amelioration in the early Holocene, and the increasing that we have here, evidence for that. And here the radiocarbon data. So here we have at the moment 3 sites, T-pillar sites with radiocarbon data. One being the Valley Chori, which is where Hauptmann worked before he moved then with Klaus Schmidt to Göbekli Tepe. We have Yeni Mahalle, which is another probable T-pillar site in the center of Urfa, Şanlıurfa, and we have Göbekli Tepe with the most radiocarbon dates. We have 84 in total at the moment. And then we have other Upper Euphrates sites. All of these are, well, the first 2 or 3 are actually in Southeast, the rest are actually in northern Syria. And then we have the Tigris region further east and the Tigris in northern Iraq. What you can see here, quite interestingly, is that we have a clear break in radiocarbon data. I mean, just because we don't have the data doesn't mean that the occupations weren't continuing, but in many of these sites, occupation actually stops at the end of the PPNA, majority of sites. The same also applies, although it's not quite so clear, in the Upper Euphrates in northern Syria, with occupation actually being limited or breaking off, focusing on just 2 or 3 particular sites where obviously a population was moving into and it was actually expanding. But even there, things sort of gradually come to a close into the PPNB. So let's have a look. We can see that again on the chart here. So here's the Younger Dryas, the pre-Neolithic, as it were, Epipaleolithic, and then we have the PPNA. You can see that here. So a drastic increase in sites in the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then, of course, in the early PPNB, we have what I've termed PPNA hunter crisis. We have a drastic reduction of sites here in the Tigris region, and a focus on 1 or 2 individual sites. The same happening in the northern Euphrates, along the Euphrates here. But in the Urfa region here, it's Göbekli Tepe, we have this explosion of new sites. A lot of them aren't actually now radiocarbon dated. We're still waiting for radiocarbon data because excavations have started at many of them. But a lot of them are known from surface survey. They're all T-pillar sites, and they look extremely PPNB from what we've seen so far. Among those sites here are Habet-Swen Tepesi. I mentioned it previously. Here's this sort of very classical type that we have at building that we have at Göbekli Tepe. You can see it here from the air. And then we have Karahan Tepe. Now, Karahan Tepe is the second excavation of a sister site to Göbekli Tepe. And as you can see here, there's another T-pillar in situ here. We have these wonderful things coming out of these buildings coming out here, all carved from the limestone plateau. And excavations of Karahan Tepe just started in 2019. And there are also excavations at about a dozen, or will be at about 10, 11 other sites, all dating to the Neolithic. So there's a major new Neolithic project starting in Southeastern Turkey. It started last year, actually looking into this T-pillar phenomenon. And of course, this is also Karahan Tepe. This is fieldwork from last year. I was there on a visit last year. You can see this wonderful big structure, very similar to what we have at Tepe. Absolutely equal. T-pillars also carved from the limestone. This is all limestone again, with the benches, as we know from Göbekli. So really astounding. So what I'm saying is we seem to have like a slight or a demographic decline to the east and to the south of the Urfa region, and this apparent demographic increase of T-pillar sites in the Urfa region. But why is this? Now, I think we have to think about the challenges that are taking place at this time. Going through this transition from hunting to farming is not an easy thing. Of course, it's not happening overnight. It's a very gradual process. But I think most the sedentary hunter-gatherers, okay? And if you're sedentary, of course, population tends to increase. And with that population increase, you have a lot of challenges facing you. You have incipient hierarchization of society. You have surplus, people laying claim to certain resources. You have conflict potentially increasing. You've got to keep the group together. At the moment, we have no real evidence that there was any conflict at the time. So there must have been mechanisms in place to mitigate these challenges that were taking place at this time. And I think Göbekli Tepe and sites like it were those mitigating mechanisms. Now, if you look at the layout of these special buildings, you see, it's a round oval, and if these T-pillars are all human representations or groups of human, representing different groups, we see them sitting around in a circle with two central beings in the middle. And what we're seeing here is an assembly, a group coming together, discussing. It is more than just a temple. This is very much a social gathering. And in those social gathering, we have, as I say, these wonderful narratives being told. And these are narratives which I think are keeping the groups together, mitigating this rising pressure that was emanating or coming from this change in their economies. Although at the same time, like I said, there is no evidence for domesticated animals or crops at Göbekli Tepe. At Nevali Chori, we do have a little bit of domesticates. They're not strange, especially considering that we're into the PPNB here. Now, why was that? Was it perhaps taboo? Are we perhaps seeing here that the hunter-gatherers really trying to preserve their Paleolithic past? And I think I'm moving more in this direction now. I think what we're seeing here is a very last pinnacle, and perhaps really the pinnacle of late hunter-gatherers in this region prior to the transition, the point of no return, as it were, into the Neolithic. And these narratives are forcing or enforcing or the values and the worldview of hunter-gatherers. Just a note here, it's very interesting that these so-called handbags, we're talking about the feature here with the corbelled roofing. Perhaps what we're seeing here is actually the buildings themselves with corbelled roofs. And then, of course, here, like I said, the stories that go along with the late Paleolithic or the last hunter-gatherers in this region. And of course, ancestors, I said at the beginning, for me, there's no evidence that we're dealing with deities at the moment, but we're certainly probably dealing with ancestor veneration. And we have these wonderful small finds of human skull fragments from the fill of the buildings, which we slip down in from burials, perhaps skull caches underneath the floors of the PPNB buildings. We find these fragmented then when we excavate the bigger buildings. And you can see here the scratch marks have been treated post-mortem treatment of these bones, some having drill holes. We don't actually think that these were from trepanations, but actually from suspicion of these, perhaps in the special buildings themselves. So we think the ancestor veneration was extremely important. And a lot of the T-pillars, some of the T-pillars actually have little drill holes in them where you could have actually attached things on cords. And we also think that the T-pillars were actually dressed themselves. They wouldn't have been plain stone. They probably also painted. We have a little bit of evidence for colour at the site on the T-pillars, and they were probably also dressed. I mentioned the T-pillar in D with the loincloth. Now, those were actually found in on the floor of the building. The remains of a fox, also the claws of the fox. So we think that maybe that the buildings or the T-pillars were actually adorned with leathers, with furs, etc. as well. One last slide, because I've kept you much longer than I planned to, I think. Of course, things progressed after Göbekli Tepe. After Göbekli Tepe was abandoned, at the end of the 9th millennium, the latest, all of this disappeared. But we still see certain things carrying on, which was still important for late Neolithic populations as well. And one of those is this wonderful, we see this is in building H, we have this wonderful depiction of an aurochs, its legs buckled, its tongue hanging out. Here's a smaller animal here as well, perhaps you can see that. We have these sort of sticks coming out here, perhaps spears, the tongue hanging out. It's all sort of depicting the death throes of this animal. And we have a nice find from the site as well. We have a humerus from an aurochs with an embedded flint arrowhead as well. It's very special. This aurochs dating is something that carried on into the late Neolithic. You're obviously aware of Çatalhöyük and the wall painting there. This is the same thing we're seeing, but we're here on the left-hand side. We're about 8,500 BC in southeastern Turkey, and this is central Turkey 2,000 years later. So things did continue, but some things were left behind. And I would like to thank you for your attention. I have a lot of people to thank. It's not just me, as I mentioned, it's a whole team, including the guys from the and of course our sponsors and collaboration partners. So thank you to them as well. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Does it? I guess can we do the questions in the chat, and then just so we're not all talking over each other. So if you have a question, throw it in the chat. I know there was one earlier, but I think you kind of answered it. But Jessica had a question. I'm trying to find it here. What was here? I lost the chat for some reason. I think it was regarding mudslides. And then you kind of covered that there were.
Oh, right, yeah. I mean, this is something very important for us now. You know, it's the problem is, of course, is this new interpretation that we're now sort of formulating. You know, it's still work in progress, but it really sort of getting the message out there, because it's not actually, people don't want to hear it. They have the world's first temples, they know what the site is, and they're not always open to new interpretations. Of course, for advertising, of course, it's a bit late. This is how the site is being, I don't want to say marketed, it sounds a bit brutal, but you know, how it's being portrayed in the media to attract attention. And of course, we're having a hard time actually, you know, convincing people of not the opposite, but to actually relativize things a little bit. And it was considered, you know, the non-plus ultra, the smoking gun of neolithization. No, it was the change. You know, religion was first, and religion then led to this transition in the economy from hunter-gathering to farming, and not the other way around as was previously thought. But you know, that argument just does not hold. I mean, especially as we don't have any domesticated species at the site. So where, you know, if we have such an important site that led to this transition, why are we not seeing the domesticates at the site? And that's why I think, you know, we're very much still in this hunter-gatherer. Why are we then, you know, and interestingly at Çatalhöyük, I just showed you on the last slide, late Neolithic site, 2,000 years later, their ritual areas are also in the domestic sphere. They're actually, you know, in the cellars of the buildings, much like at Göbekli Tepe. So we're seeing this sort of move from the big communal buildings to the domestic sort of ritual area at Göbekli Tepe already in the 9th millennium BC, way before the late Neolithic.
So does anyone have a question they want to throw in the chat? I don't know what happened to the earlier stuff. I can't see it anymore.
Everyone else. Let me have a look.
Let me change the mute here to where. Okay, I changed it to allow you to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and pop in here.
Let's have a look. I'm just going through the chat myself to see.
Oh, you can see it?
Yeah, I can see it as well. Just put it on.
Okay. So
a lot of questions came up with it.
What's that?
I'm just going through. Hang on. Something out here, repeat maintenance. I mean, a very important point. Obviously, a lot of this building material was recycled. I mean, recycling is a bit of a key word for Göbekli Tepe, because a lot of the buildings, I mean, if you're going to carve a T-pillar 5.5 meters in height, or 3 meters, you're not going to sort of, if you build a new phase of the building, you're going to use the same pillar. So we actually do find, for example, in building H, we have T-pillars, we have slots, vacant slots where T-pillars have actually been removed, and the slot left, and then the T-pillar probably replaced in a later phase of the building. You know, this is you see it everywhere at the site. I mean, why bother then carving a new pillar when you can use an old one? And you see also in some cases, as one pillar, for example, one way around, they've turned it around, they've got the orientation different probably to the previous one, because the pendant on the neck is facing to the back of the pillar of the building and not to the front. So there are various pieces of evidence for that. So recycling was a very important aspect. Myvan also mentions pictographs in addition to the animal reliefs, but he doesn't show any photos or talk about them. There are a few carvings on the plateau floor, or on the surface of the plateau. They're still there, but I think that a lot of them are actually markings, perhaps marking areas for quarrying, perhaps as a sort of a claim within the plateau. It's so difficult to reconstruct a lot of the symbols at Göbekli Tepe in a more precise way. I mean, I've been very general, saying that it's their narratives. Sounds very difficult to say. And of course, what we don't have yet is the sort of the chronology of the artistic tradition. Now, we've got a PhD that's just started on that to work out, how does the art change over a 1500-year period? I mean, so far, comparisons are made between PPNA sites and the Tigris and stuff that we find in Göbekli Tepe from the PPNB, but we're talking about 1500 years. Okay, it's PPN, but what were the traditions over that very long period of time? And that's this topic of a new PhD that's just started here in Istanbul at the same time. So we're looking forward to results from that. But it would certainly appear that things, I mean, the T-pillars themselves only appear in the Urfa region. We do have standing pillars, vertical pillars in the Tigris region as well, but never these full-blown T-pillar that we have in the Urfa region.
What was the David Graeber question? Angie asked about.
I have to admit, I haven't read it yet.
What's that?
I have to admit, I haven't read it yet. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's on my reading list. I haven't got to actually reading it yet. I think I must in my next holiday or in the evening. But I haven't read it. But I think about. I mean, I'm just wondering. I mean, I haven't obviously read it, so it's difficult to answer the question. But it will be interesting to see what he has to say about Göbekli Tepe. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of is used about Göbekli Tepe has not actually considered our most recent results from the site. I mean, that's not just the fault, or not the fault of the authors that I'm saying here. It's also the fact that a lot of it has not yet been published. It's still being evaluated and will come in due course. Although there are a couple of preliminary publications out there. But this is archaeology, things change, and that pretty rapidly if you get to dig in the right place. And the Göbekli Tepe, you open a new trench, or your trench, and it's very new stuff coming out. We're lucky enough to continue our excavations this year, or last year, I keep saying this year, but 2021. We were able to get down there for a while, for 3 months, and take care, because we weren't there in 2020. And we were actually excavating then to the north of Building D on the slope in some of these rectangular buildings. We've got some wonderful results from there. I mean, the buildings, we have this slope architecture now, and probably between the buildings themselves, the sort of corridors. We have a growing picture of the settlement in the PPNB, which is an area that wasn't considered much in the past. Of course, a lot of attention was placed on these monumental buildings with the big T-pillars, but the domestic buildings on the slope, on the surrounding slopes, are equally as fascinating and give a better glimpse into the everyday of Göbekli Tepe instead of this sort of ritual or special buildings.
I think Lisa had a question about Stephen Mithen's book. Do you see that one?
What's been done? Pictographs in addition to the animal reliefs. I don't know which one he's referring to now. I mean, apart from the pictographs, I have to pass on that, I'm afraid. I don't know which ones he's referring to. But at the moment, we've got a couple of publications in preparation, or actually with reviewers. They should be out pretty soon. We have a pillar. A volume dedicated to the decorated pillars in the special buildings, and also there are the two PhD dissertations, which will be soon available. They're going to be translated soon from German into English, and then will be published in our Göbekli Tepe series, in archaeological is a series, the DAI, and they'll be published, I hope, this year, as soon as possible.
Would it be all right if I gave them your email address if they have further questions?
Yeah, sure, that's not a problem.
Okay.
If anyone has any more specific questions, they can always email me. I'm just looking here, estimates of population density for this period, very, very difficult. I mean, you can obviously use ethnographic sort of figures from sort of late hunter-gatherer or sort of hunter-gatherer and sort of early farming type settlements known from ethnographic studies. But the entire settlement was populated at the same, was in use or occupied at the same time, or it's just parts of it. But if the whole site, which is quite a large site, we're talking several 70, 50, 60 hectares, it's going to be a very big population. I mean, we're into mega sites, if you think about it in that respect. So it's difficult to say, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess, to be perfectly honest, but normally the sites are much smaller, other sites within the area, but these particular sites, especially Göbekli and now Callahan, there's another one as well which is equally as large. These are very big sites, and the question is, were they occupied the whole area at the same time? If so, big sites, but I'm thinking more in the region, or more likely that they were sort of different areas were occupied at different times within that long period.